Steve can sit in his seat. Everybody else is encouraged not to sit in Steve's seat. If anybody is concerned about their car or anything, you might want to run out and close your windows or whatever is necessary. I think we can get started. Want to welcome everybody to our latest in our ongoing series of presentations by Beth Israel members. We're really pleased to welcome Margaret Mordukhovich to our bima to talk about her book. I'm going to read to you from a couple of sources that I dug up about Margaret's book, and then I will welcome her to the bima. So it says here that in this beautifully written memoir, Margaret Mordukhovich traces her life from her early childhood during Stalin's era in the Soviet Union, through her school years, marriage, and the birth of her children, to the process of emigrating during perestroika and finally beginning a new life in the United States, ultimately settling in Ann Arbor, Michigan. She skillfully weaves together events, thoughts, feelings, and experiences with important historical context, allowing readers to gain a deeper understanding of the times she lived in and how they shaped her. She introduces us to the most important people in her life, both past and present, and invites readers to deeply understand the struggles of those times, as well as the unexpected triumphs. That's from her own webpage or from her publisher's page. From the Kirkus Review, it says that the book is a powerful story of resilience that provides firsthand insights into life in the Soviet Union. Over the course of this decades-spanning remembrance, Mordukhovich offers an accessible account that provides ample context for its myriad historical and geopolitical references, despite its brisk format. It's divided into more than 50 chapters of no more than 5 pages each, which effectively aids readability. The clear emphasis on reader engagement is only enhanced by a wealth of maps and family photographs which date from the early 20th century to the present. I'm very pleased to welcome Margaret Mordukhovich to the bima, and she will both talk about the book and read from the book. Then we'll have time afterwards for Q&A here, and then out in the foyer we'll have coffee and cookies, along with an opportunity to purchase the book and have Margaret sign copies for you.
Thank you very much. Well, you will have to forgive me if you think I'm nervous. You are very wrong. I'm not nervous. I'm terrified. It's the first time I'm publicly presenting this book, so you will have to excuse me as I progress. Probably my voice will become steadier. We all hope. And I would like to start with, thank you. Yeah, let's put it. This is in case if I lose my voice. I would like to start with thanking the synagogue, with thanking the rabbi, with thanking Jerry, with thanking Barb for organizing this event. And everyone expects this from me, but I have another thanks to give. I think many of you, or your parents, or your grandparents were active in the fight for Soviet Jewry. And if you are, if you were, I'm extremely grateful to you. Because of you, my first life ended, and we were able, me and my family were able to start a second life more than 36 years ago. And actually, I see one person. She just entered, Helen Aminov, when our second life started, and we started it in Connecticut and Stanford because there were 2 people in America whom we knew. They were our friends, they were experienced Americans, they came to this country a year before us. So we went to Connecticut, I started working, and Boris was looking for a professorship, and we spent 8 months in Connecticut. We moved to Ann Arbor, and we had quite a crew. We had 2 people and we had 2 parents. Boris's parents were with us, and Helen Aminov was extremely handy in helping them to find their apartment. And as I said, huge thanks to everyone who made, not just for me, but for my Russian friends who are here, who made it possible, who were fighting for us. Okay, I'll be talking about this book and I'll be reading from this book. So you would see how I write and how I speak. You already saw. Well, it's hard to read from the book because though it looks small, it really is 51 chapters. It really is 250 pages. So I selected a couple of chapters, and I'm afraid the first chapters will be sad because they describe sad events which happened really. Let me say a little bit about my family. My family was slightly, well, first of all, when I was writing this book, I was trying not to write just the memoir. I was really trying to put it into historic perspective. And my family, my life, my neighbors gave me plenty of opportunity to do it because in some sense my family was not very typical for a Jewish family from a big city in our time. Most of our friends didn't sit at the Seder table. They didn't know Yiddish. Religion was suppressed. They had nothing to do with it. I was very fortunate. Well, I come from a very long line of rabbis. There was a family legend that in one branch of the family there were 40 generations, which is, of course, no one could know. But everyone I knew and everyone I heard about were really rabbis. And my father, he started studying in a yeshiva because, of course, you're a son of a rabbi, you will become a rabbi. In 1925, the yeshivas were closed. And he had a good secular career, but he was a capable man and he retained the knowledge of Hebrew. And he had this spirituality or something that influenced us. I also had a grandfather, and I will read about my grandfather, a little bit about my parents, who in the darkest years, he kept a minyan in his house. And as a small child, I saw this, traditionally dressed Jews, very different. Some of them were dressed nicely, some wore shabby clothes, but they were coming to fulfill this obligation to pray on Shabbat. And the last 2 years of his life, my grandfather spent in our small apartment because my parents moved him with us. And I was a child who was asking questions at the Seder, the Passover Seder. It's nothing to most Americans. I was the only one. We were social, we had a huge circle of friends. I was the only one who had this experience. And I'm sure I was not the only one in the Soviet Union, but among the circle of friends. And I think And our child, our older daughter, started fasting on Yom Kippur at 13 in Soviet Union, and we were fasting, and I think it brought another dimension to my life. I honestly think so, and I'm extremely grateful for this experience. Let me start reading. Well, I'll be reading pieces from one chapter from another. That's why I typed them. Also, the font is much bigger, so I'll read from here. And I'll start with my parents. Well, my life started in the post-war Soviet Union, in our tiny room, where my parents, my lucky parents, who had lost everything in the war. Their first house, their modest furniture, their white linens, all of it became black smoke, all but themselves. They survived. Their lives were forever divided by the most heinous war of the 20th century, just as mine would be divided by immigration, the before and the after. Before that war, there was early childhood, school, siblings, revolution, hunger, World War I, German occupation, civil war, no rights, no religious freedom, a normal life for two children born in Russia in 1912. They both came from long lines of rabbis. What could have been worse than that in the 20s and the 30s in the Soviet Union? Wikipedia has an article titled Lishenets, which means that this word is now known in English-speaking countries. This term describes people who were officially disenfranchised in the Soviet Union for 18 long years, from 1918 till 1936. Private merchants, clergy, manufacturers, successful farmers, and many other categories of people were on this list. These people were not just denied the right to vote, this status affected most aspects of their lives. One of the striking examples, they and their children were not allowed to receive higher or technical education. All of this directly impacted the fate of my parents. My mom wanted to be a medical doctor. She went far away to Stalingrad, where nobody knew that she was the daughter of a rabbi. She was admitted to the medical college, but contracted typhus, barely survived it, then relapsed and barely survived it again. Being very weak, she had to quit school and go back to Gomel to be with her parents. Mom would have made a fine doctor, I'm sure. She was very kind, very perceptive, and very smart. Instead, she became a bookkeeper, which was a very Jewish profession in the Soviet Union. Now, Dad was able to enter the university only in 1936, at 24, when the government finally lifted all the restrictions. I'm sure they tried to conform. Children always do. They worked, studied, sang Soviet songs, and wore Soviet clothes. They were young, they met, fell in love, and married. In a year, their son was born. He was named after my mom's grandfather, Rabbi Boruch Komisarov. His Hebrew name was Boruch, but no one knew about it. Officially, he was Boris, just a regular Boris, like the son of their Russian neighbor. He was circumcised, but God forbid the neighbors find out. People were arrested left and right for lesser offenses. There must have been something those people did wrong. A skipped meeting, an incautious joke, a reckless word. Be careful. The walls have ears. Your tongue is your enemy. Lower your voice. I mentioned here the name of Rabbi Boruch Komisarov. I have his picture in my book. It's the only picture of all my great-grandparents I ever saw. And I know just one detail about him, but it's worth mentioning. When pogroms were ravaging Jewish shtetls, he went to speak with the local priest. This priest gave a touching sermon to his flock, and their shtetl stayed calm. There were no pogroms there. I also heard the story about him approving of his grandkids having a good secular education. He said, if not rabbis, let them become lawyers or doctors and give good money to tzedakah, to charity. When you think that all of this was happening 120 years ago in Russia, I'm amazed that in the time of the Tsar Nicholas II, my grandfather was already building the interface bridges, and quite successfully, and was all for good secular education for his grandchildren. And this, I mentioned, be careful, the walls have ears. It's not in the book, but it's private story. When we came to Connecticut and I was studying frantically for my first interview, my husband Boris, he was on the phone, and I heard him criticizing the Soviets. And I was very busy, and I mechanically lifted my head and said, Boris, don't speak like this on the phone. And I was so ashamed after it, because I realized how deeply it was, this fear was ingrained in me, that after already coming to America, I was afraid. I mean, it was like a spontaneous thought which came from me. Well, before the war started, my parents managed to scrape some money together and bought a house, their first home. Of course, it was small, almost tiny, but my mom painted both rooms white, and that immediately made them look clean and festive. She made curtains from her old skirt, light gray, with tiny blue flowers, and my dad found them very pretty. They slept on the floor for a while, but they were young, so what did it matter? They both worked, raised a child, my only brother. My dad went to college at night. I grew up hearing how he was always the best student, and how my brother was always the best, and how I would always get straight A's one day. It was expected, nothing less would do. Before the German invasion, people were told that the Soviet army was strong, much stronger than Hitler's army. However, once the actual war started, the Germans kept getting closer and closer, and the bombings became worse every day. My dad had the option of staying with his factory, which would exempt him from frontline service, because the factory was working for the army from the beginning of the war. However, he wanted to fight the Nazis. When the pictures of my dad in the military uniform are in this book, and even now to this day when I look at his pictures, it's almost funny, because it's hard to imagine a less soldierly man, you know. From these pictures, a young, skinny man with round eyeglasses and a huge forehead gently smiles at me, a man with a kind, scholarly face. It's hard to imagine him with a gun. It is impossible to picture him shooting at other people. It is tragic to know that at times people like him have to shoot to defend their families, their homes, and their country. And now I will read the whole chapter. It's probably will explain the main reason why my father wanted to fight so much. His family suffered enormous loss during the war. And this is the saddest chapter in my book. It will become more cheerful from here. But that it is. Well, anyway, I forgot to bring the picture of my grandmother. I have a picture of my grandmother, whom I never met. I never met any of my grandmothers. It was drawn by my uncle, who was an artist. He was actually, I have a chapter dedicated to him. He was a chief artist of the biggest movie studio in Belarus. He was a very talented man. And in this picture, you will see the portrait of his mother, engulfed in flames, basically. When the war started, Margolis, Giankin, Nipinsky lived in a small shtetl alone. All 8 of her children had left the place for bigger cities and greater opportunities. When the Germans approached, she didn't want to leave her house and ran. She was almost 60, an old woman in her own eyes. Whatever she had there, her house, chickens, not much else, was precious to her. Besides, German soldiers had stayed in her house during World War I. Those Germans were civil, gave chocolate to the kids, and she, like many others around, dismissed the rumors of recent German atrocities as Bolshevik propaganda. She decided to stay, and so did many other people. The able-bodied men who could be seen as a problem for the occupation were all in the Red Army fighting Nazis anyway. They were sure that no one would touch old folks, women, or small children. They expected hunger, difficult times. Who could have predicted what happened anyway? When I was still a toddler, a young man came to visit my dad. This man was probably no more than 14 in 1942. He was one of the very few, possibly the only one from the Shchedrin ghetto who survived. I believe on the day of the massacre, he escaped and was very lucky to have been accepted by the partisans. In November of 1942, Moscow sent a radiogram to commanders of partisan formations forbidding the admission of surviving Jews into their units. I mean, the Jews who escaped from ghettos, partisans wouldn't take it as. This order led to the deaths of thousands of Jews who miraculously escaped from the ghettos and were ready to fight. By that time, eventually, specifically, Jewish partisan groups were forming in Belarus forest, and this young man may have joined one of them. The Nazis started with those whom they deemed unable to work. First, they rounded up old people and small children, took them to the synagogue, poured gasoline at the corners, and set the building on fire. The synagogue was in a small wooden house. It went up in flames very quickly. The final liquidation of the Shchedrin ghetto happened on March 8, 1942. The Nazis came, they rounded up all the remaining Jews, took them to the Jewish cemetery and killed them. My father told me that he lost 40 of his close relatives, his aunts, uncles, cousins, and their small children on that day, not counting the more distant family members. Altogether, more than 2,000 Jews were murdered on a single day. The Shchedrin ghetto, which had functioned for 8 months, ceased to exist. I was born several years after the Second World War. My parents named me after my grandmother, Margolis. They often told me that I have a shy smile, and when I'm sad or scared, I cover my mouth exactly the way she did. I'm very sorry I never met her. Can you still hear me? I'm very sorry I never met her. I always felt that not knowing both my grandmother has robbed me of something very important. I probably missed the unconditional love only a grandmother can give. I inherited nothing from her except a gesture and a smile. I never even visited the village where Nazis murdered her. Why? Then why do I think so often about her? Why do I look every day at her portrait? In this portrait drawn by her son, she is engulfed in flames, covering her mouth with that very familiar gesture. Am I more aware of being Jewish because of her horrible fate? Did it make me more attuned to the dangers of anti-Semitism, of any hate? I do not know, but in my genes and my genetic memories, there is definitely an aura of her death. With my parents and my brother gone, I am now the witness to her memory, and when I am gone, my children and grandchildren will carry this weight. I remember very well how my dad and his landsmen were collecting money for the monument of Shchedrin Ghetto. It was a simple black monument which was finished in 1963, and the inscription on it honored the murdered Jews of Shchedrin in two languages, Russian and Yiddish. I also remember that one woman, who unfortunately was also Jewish and whose relatives were in the same mass grave, wrote a complaint either to the Communist Party authorities or to the KGB, denouncing the actions of Shchedrin survivors as Jewish nationalism. The Yiddish inscription disappeared, as did any explicit mentions of the victims as Jews. Instead, it honored the peaceful inhabitants who were killed in Shchedrin. I would rather not write these last paragraphs, but I am afraid I should. The survivor of the Shchedrin massacre also maybe we should wait 2 minutes. Well, I'll continue. If you don't hear, tell me. This survivor of the Shchedrin massacre also told my parents what I call the story of the Shabbos Goy. This story is hard to comprehend and even harder to put into writing. A Shabbos Goy is usually a person, a Gentile, who goes from one Jewish home to another on Shabbat doing things a religious Jew cannot do on this holiday of rest. Such a person knows everyone in the shtetl, and usually his or her relationship with Jewish neighbors is good or even friendly. When the Nazis at gunpoint were taking Jews to the cemetery for what was to be their final walk, final breath of fresh air, and final prayer, desperate mothers were trying to hide their kids, at least the little ones, the favorite ones, the babies. The Shabbos Goy entered the houses along with the soldiers and collaborationist policemen, counted the children, and would often say, Moishe is not here, Yankele is missing. She helped the murderers find the hidden children and bring them to their death. After the war, the house of this woman was full of meager Jewish possessions. My father saw his family's Shabbat candlesticks on her window sills. The survivors talked to the Soviet police, but no one was interested in bringing her to justice. One can only hope that she got justice in another world. Well, this is the story of my grandmother, and my grandfather. My grandfather, well, I'll read a little bit more, then we'll talk a little bit more. I do not remember seeing my grandfather for the first time, but my mom never let me forget that I threw a tantrum and screamed, "Go away, old man with the bird." In my own defense, I have to say that I was not yet 2 at that time, and that he certainly looked very different from all the other men I usually saw. In the 50s, all Soviet men were dressed the same way. They usually wore almost identical dark-colored suits, boring ties, and wide-brimmed hats. Their faces were clean-shaven, and they were all sported identical haircuts. My grandfather was an Orthodox Jew who looked and dressed in accordance with his beliefs and tradition. He had a long gray beard, which he never cut. He always covered his head and wore a long dark coat with fringes showing underneath. As I grew up, I learned to appreciate his knowing look of a sage, his kind and wise twinkling eyes. In tough times when the government persecuted all religions, Leib Zunz, his last name was Zunz, held a daily minyan prayer in his home. Well, I talked a little bit about it, so I will probably skip it. There were no young men who came to the minyan, only old people, the remnants of this not so distant past. To any observer, their face would seem to be on the verge of dying, yet it survived the Soviet times too. Throughout his life, he strictly observed Jewish law, but he understood that the Soviet regime made it extremely difficult to avoid work on Shabbat and to abide by the dietary laws. His last several years were spent in Minsk in our one-bedroom apartment. By that time, my brother was married and living with his wife at her parents' place. My grandfather shared the bedroom with me. My parents, as usual, slept on a sofa in the living room. Our household, though emphatically Jewish, was not kosher. Mom kept 3 separate sets of dishes for my grandfather. One for dairy food, one for meat, and one for Passover. He ate meat only on Jewish holidays when it was possible to find a shoichet, a ritual slaughterer, at the farmer's market. My mom kept his food on a separate shelf in the refrigerator. My grandfather knew that the rest of the family ate whatever mom was able to buy that day. When I grew up, I started appreciating his tolerance. He certainly was unhappy with our way of life, but he never showed it. He told me once that he was grateful to me for bringing friends home and not being ashamed of his strange looks. Later, I found out why he almost never went for a walk or ventured outside to sit in the small garden in the yard. When not protected by the walls of our apartment, he was always mocked by children and scorned by adults. I was 12 when he came to live with us, and I suspect that he also thought his appearances outside would make my life more difficult. Wise and spiritual, my grandfather possessed a mysterious ability to foresee the future. My cousin from Leningrad drowned in Ukraine, far away from anyone he knew. His parents' notification of his death came simultaneously with a letter from my granddad, where he consoled them for their tragic loss. The letter from Gomel, Belarus, was postmarked on the day the tragedy happened. There was never any explanation, he just knew. The family lore full of similar stories. He saved his oldest son during Stalin's purges by making him throw away his radio the day before the KGB, responding to anonymous denunciation that he was listening to foreign radio stations, knocked on his door. All the children and grandchildren, most of them intellectuals and skeptics, nonetheless believed him to be their guardian and protector even after his death. Both my brother and I named our own kids after him. There is my nephew in the audience who was named after my grandfather, Leib. These days we all know things that gave religion a bad name. Leib Zunz, of blessed memory, gave it a good name, and I'm always grateful to him for this. I also believe that he has made me a little better and a little stronger. Well, now let's talk about my parents a little bit more, about my mom. There is a lot about my mom in this book. I have her monologues in the book, which are written in cursive, where my mom was a natural storyteller. That's why maybe, and sometimes I'm confused. Do you remember this? Or did she tell it to me many times and it feels to me that I remember the stories? After all, I'll probably read a little chapter about book burning, and I was I was very little at that time, so this was probably her story. My mom had I had two parents, and they were as different as day and night. My mom had a very strong personality. If, as in the famous joke, the main difference between a terrorist and a Jewish mother is that you can negotiate with a terrorist, then my mom was the ultimate Jewish mother. Before I got married, almost nothing was open to discussion. Not food, not clothes, and not my curfew. Every attempt to disagree she met with, of course, if I say it's black, you say it's white. And this was the end of the conversation. I often joke that I married very young because, well, it gave me some freedom to eat what I want. Boris knows my mom, so he will not be offended. At home, Mom was most certainly the boss. She handled all practical matters. She had good hands and knew not only how to cook or sew, but also how to repair broken electric iron and a leaking faucet, how to build furniture, and how to wallpaper and paint. In everyday life, she treated Dad like a small child. She often said that if Dad needed to hammer a nail into the wall, he would drive it head first. She handled money, made vacation plans, purchased what was necessary, and took care of the sick. She had enough energy to hit a small town. Dad was very gentle and very impractical. He seldom argued with her or with anyone else. At the same time, their relationship was not one of a shrewish wife and a hand-packed husband. Looking back, I realized that Mom loved and respected him too much to bully him. My 5.5 narrow-boned, skinny Dad seemed tall and broad-shouldered to Mom. She respected his judgments, his religious beliefs, his spirituality, his tenderness. Mom was a drama queen. She never suffered in silence, always exaggerated her woes, and the world was mostly black and white to her. She was a strong-willed woman, sometimes judgmental, with a great sense of humor. Dad always downplayed things, always found excuses for everyone and explanations for everything. For better or worse, I inherited my dad's personality. Because of him, or possibly because of my mom, I became a self-proclaimed member of what I call the Men's Defense League, which was a stroke of luck for my husband and probably not that good for me. Despite his gentle personality when things were important to my dad, to his conscience, he stuck to his guns, and no one, not even Mom, could do anything about it. It was very unusual for an officer in the Red Army during the war not to become a member of the Communist Party. He somehow managed it. His career seriously suffered from the lack of party membership. That didn't matter to him. I cannot imagine him doing something he considered morally wrong. I also never saw my bossy mom harass him about the things he considered important. Dad was not involved in any anti-Soviet activity, but he really disliked the Communist Party and the Soviet government. When he saw the especially nasty members of the Politburo, various general secretaries of the Communist Party on TV, he would always say, "Marshme vizachro," which translates as "may his name and his memory be erased." Dad hardly ever cursed, but Wikipedia states that imashme, he said imashme, here imashmo, is one of the strongest curses in the Hebrew language. Well, I'm afraid. Time is flying. I should get moving. Mom, I'll skip parts of the chapter. Mom often said that she would like to die before Dad, that she didn't want to live without him. It sounded a little bit melodramatic, very consistent with her usual drama queen behavior. Later events proved that she really meant it. Dad died unexpectedly. My birthday, 1985, happened right after Yom Kippur. Dad was very happy that evening. He spent the whole of Yom Kippur in his synagogue, fasting, leading the services, praying. On my birthday, he looked unusually happy. He said that he was sure all those whom he loved would have a great year. I was 8 months pregnant, and uncharacteristically, my very reserved dad suddenly told me that much as they loved me, they loved my older daughter, Lena, even more, and would be so happy to welcome another baby into the family soon. The next day, Dad left the apartment to visit us. His heart suddenly stopped. The neighborhood children found him, but when the ambulance arrived, he was already dead. In death, my long-nosed, very Jewish-looking dad was beautiful, just as Mom always saw him. Mom outlived him by 10 years, but in reality, she died with him. Since the day Dad passed away, she was never the same. She wandered empty-eyed from room to room, only about him and blaming everyone for his death. Children usually don't see romance in their parents' lives. Only many years later, I realized that theirs was a real love story. Well, if I have to start moving. One second, I think I prepared too many pages and I'm looking at my watch now. Well, I probably will stop reading for a while and just tell me about it. Well, I'm writing in this book about many things. About the visit of KGB to our house, where my mom's quick wits actually saved Dad. It was in Stalin time. As you know, in the 30s, Stalin was killing people indiscriminately. Nationality didn't really matter much, but in the 40s, after the war, it was Jews. And we later found out that the neighbor wrote, I guess the reasons were always or often very, very simple. She wanted the room my parents occupied. It was a good reason to write a letter to KGB. And fortunately, my father's boss was called to KGB, and he refused to sign that my dad was a Jewish nationalist. More than that, he warned my dad. They both knew Hebrew. My dad, in the childhood, was studying to be a rabbi, because everyone was a rabbi. The yeshivas were closed in Soviet Union when he was 13. And he was a very capable man. He got secular education, went to graduate school. He was really very capable. And he and the man who was his boss and who was called to KGB, they both knew Hebrew, which was quite unusual in Soviet Union at that time. And since the walls had ears, everyone had to be very careful. This boss met my dad at work, and he told him in Hebrew, "Be careful, be a father to your children." And my dad came home. He was scared, but my mom was a woman of action, and she was thinking about what can cause dad's arrest. She looked at the bookshelves. We had many books in Yiddish. Books in Hebrew were not published, but we had many Yiddish books. My mom burned the books. She took them to the yard and burned them. We also had a small radio. I honestly not sure. My father was listening to the Voices of America, to Call Israel, all the time I remember him. But I don't think even it was possible in the 40s. Probably was possible because my mom took this radio set and she ripped the wires of the radio set. The KGB came. They knocked on the door. They marched to the bookshelf where the center place was now taken by the selected works of Lenin and Marx, which everyone was, and my father among them, was expected to buy. I don't think our house was full of books from the floor to the ceilings. They were all read, believe me, we were all readers, we read books. I don't think these books were ever opened, but they were put on the front shelf. Mom was a genius. They marched then to the radio set. Mom casually said, "Oh, this junk doesn't work." We bought it, we meant to repair, we never did. And then a miracle happened. They left. My father was never arrested. My grandfather always believed that his prayers saved him. Mom was sure that her quick wit sent him. Probably Mom was right. Anyway, a miracle happened. My father was never arrested. Many people were. In this chapter, part of the chapter is a monologue of my mom, and maybe I'll read a couple of paragraphs to you just to so you will have a feel of how she spoke and how. Both my parents, by the way, they spoke perfect Russian. They didn't have any accent. But their first language was, of course, Yiddish. And my mom was very funny. Her Yiddish was very idiomatic, and she used all kinds of Yiddish expressions and all of this. I don't know if I can, a couple of paragraphs. This is about a book burning. I thought you were asleep. I talked to you a long time ago. I don't know what to do with this girl. You ask her to eat, she stores food behind her cheek. Saves it for hungry times, I guess. You ask her to drink milk, accept a fountain. You ask her to sleep tight because you need some privacy, and here she is. Her eyes round, the long ears pricked up. Well, there is something urgent I have to do. It cannot wait. I wish we had at least a warm toilet where one could lock a nosy child. Stop wailing, no one is locking you anywhere. Do you see these books? Do you see the letters? They don't look like Russian letters, do they? That's because they are not Russian. These books are in Yiddish. Yiddish is a language, like Russian. My family spoke it at home, and your dad's family too. Of course I can read it. It was the first language I learned. These are good books too. Sholem Aleichem and Lemoiches Forum. I was about to do something I never thought I would have to do. This is about saving your dad. Oh, this schwer zu sein Aid. It's very hard to be a Jew in Yiddish. How can one explain to an innocent child that people can be arrested and shot just for reading books in their native language, in their own homes? Listen, I want you to forget what I'm about to do. You know that I love books. We always buy books, even when we cannot afford it. It breaks my heart, but I'm going to burn them right now in front of my child. I love books, but I love my husband more. When they come to Czech, we'll have only Russian books. We'll have Tolstoy and Chekhov and selected works of Marx and Lenin, which they made your dad buy. You know what? Don't listen to me. Remember it. Always remember what they made me do. Tell your children about it. Tell your children and grandchildren, but not a word to the neighbors or your friends. Not a word to a living soul. Do you hear me? The only people you can tell about it are your kids. With a life like this, I'm most likely be dead by then anyway. Mom, that's what I'm doing now. I'm telling your children and grandchildren about them. Well, my father was spared. He was not arrested. As I said, as I said, 51 chapters in this book, many family photographs. When the war started, my parents lived in Gomel, and Gomel was taken 6 weeks after beginning of the war. And my father was in the army. My mom left with my brother. I was not born then. And fortunately, she took family photographs, which are precious. And I have in this book real pictures of my parents, of my grandmother, of even one of my great-grandfathers, which I really treasure. And what I write, I will finish with one last chapter, which is kind of funny, so if I have a little bit of time, right? I'll leave on a cheerful note, but in this book, I think I had some interesting family. I was trying to write in this book about people who either made a lasting impression on me, influenced me, or whom I think were typical for this period of time. Different people. Our neighbors who came back to Soviet Union after Stalin died, from Argentina, where this neighbor became a member of Communist Party. It was one thing to be a member of Communist party tour in Argentina. They came to Soviet Union. They wanted to go back. Of course, it was impossible. There are many stories. There are stories about how, Boris, my husband, and I, we met even when we were at school, at the last grade of school. There was a special mathematical school for talented, whatever, children in Minsk, and we met there when Boris's family moved to Minsk. And then we were studying, we were schoolmates at the university at the same. We studied, both of us, mathematics. And I'm writing in this book how it was going in the university, how in Soviet Union, when we were finishing the university, there was a process of distribution. You had to work where they sent you. And usually if you are a good student, you had a selection and you can choose the place. Well, we were studying, there were 300 people in our class, and they created a list. They created an honest list, considering our grades and also if you did some work. And one of the witnesses of that I'm telling the truth passed away 2 months ago. He lived in Ann Arbor. Some people knew him. Boris was number 1 on this list. I was number 4. And if you looked at about first 10 or 20 people, there were many Jewish people here. It was a fair list. They judged by the grades, but when the day of the distribution came, this list had nothing to do with the order, how we were called to be distributed. And we probably went there the first of Jewish people, and it was maybe after 200 people were already distributed. And Moishe Dubov and I, we had kind of the same fate, because we were both unexpectedly distributed to the Academy of Sciences. And we were distributed after 4 years. At the 5th year, we were working where we were distributed, and we were writing diplomas and wrote a good diploma. I was offered graduate school. And 4 days before we graduated from the university, the Academy of Sciences refused to take 4 students. So there were maybe 44 were Jewish, 4 students. Among them was Moishe Dubov and me. And our scientific career basically ended right there, because it was impossible to find a job. Boris, who is, I think he's good at what he's doing. He got a full professor tenure the moment we came to US. He never was able to find a teaching position. He actually defended his PhD working the day where he was sent, and then in the evenings and on weekends he was doing his mass. He's still doing his mass from 7 o'clock in the morning till 9 o'clock in the evening, and I have to make an appointment to discuss with him important things, but he's a professor in America. It wasn't. I'm writing about this. I'm writing about Soviet everyday life. I'm writing about that. If I had all the time I spent hunting for food, I probably would write War and Peace, at least in the volume, not in the quality. We planned to immigrate, to leave the Soviet Union at the end of 70s, and it was kind of late, because Boris was always finishing the next paper, and it will be tomorrow, and then maybe tomorrow, and then maybe again the next day. And when we finally applied, it was in the beginning of the 80s, and those of you, probably almost everyone, remember that there were Olympic Games in Soviet Union in the 80s, but before it, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, and the West was boycotting the Olympic Games, and we were the currency, we were the currency. If the West behaved well, they will let some Jews go. At that time, West behaved really poorly. They boycotted the Olympic Games, and we couldn't live. It was a very difficult period of life. For me personally, I think if I ever was close to depression, it was probably then, because very uncharacteristic. I was coming from work and I was sitting there and thinking and, oh gosh, playing solitaire, and if it works, we will leave soon. If it doesn't, we won't. Well, we were able, and then at that time the Soviets closed it for us for many years, actually. And we applied. I think the first day we were able to apply. I write a lot about this time, about how it worked, about Chernobyl, which we had in Soviet Union, many things. And finally, in the beginning of 88, we were told that we can apply. Because for 8 years before it, I know it sounds silly, sounds crazy, but I was dreaming that maybe we can become refuseniks, and then the West will know about us, and then maybe we'll let go. But we couldn't even become refuseniks, because in Minsk at that time there was a law, the rule that to apply you had to take all the relatives with you, all the direct relatives. And my brother at that moment didn't want to go. He lived in the same city. I couldn't hide him. It just didn't work. And all of a sudden, after many years of waiting, we called and they told us that we can apply. It was also not a very straightforward situation. The director of the research institute, who didn't like Jews very much, I think Boris was one of the few Jews surviving in his institute. When we applied, he wrote to KGB that Boris is too smart to be let go, and fired Boris at the same time. It was a little bit contradictory, but it was an interesting situation. I wrote about it. Anyway, since the time is pressing, in July of, I think June or July of 88, we got a permission. And I became a menace, I think. I was so afraid that they will close again, that poor Boris's parents, like older people, they wanted to take their sweet time. I was afraid that the immigration will be closed. And we managed, in 2 months, we needed money. We needed money because they took away our citizenship, but we had to pay a lot of money for it. So we were selling stuff. It was not a simple time. I write about it, but I would like to read it to you, one chapter. It's kind of, well, now it seems funny. It wasn't funny at that time, but that's what happened with us when we finally immigrated. And our first, after 8 years, after 10 years of wanted to do it, we immigrated. We came to Vienna. And that's how our time in Vienna started. Let me find the chapter. Well, when I think this chapter, I don't remember how it's called, but it should be called Confession of Two Smugglers. Okay. When we finally arrived in Vienna, representatives of two agencies met us at the railway station. Those going to Israel were quickly led away by people from the Jewish Agency for Israel. We and several other families who expressed the desire to go to the United States were put on a small bus by a representative of the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, Hayas, and driven to a small hotel in Vienna on Blumauer Gasse. We were assigned two rooms, one for our family of four and one for Boris' parents. This was the first Western city in our lives. My initial impressions of it are still very clear in my mind. Of course, being from the Soviet Union, I looked with wide eyes at the selection of goods in the stores, assortment, elegance, all of this. I cannot honestly call it window shopping. I knew that I could not afford any of this, and it was fine with me. We were free, and that was the main thing. Once in the evening, when Boris and I went for a walk, we saw a man taking money from the wall. Boris asked me what he was doing. I remembered something from reading many novels and guessed that he probably had a visa. Boris replied that we also have an Israeli visa and asked if we could get some money too. Our ignorance of the Western style of life was astonishing. We were getting some allowance from Hayas, and Vienna has paid for our accommodations. Like everyone else who left the USSR in these years, we had very limited funds, approximately $100 per person. Hence, $400 for our small family. Our team, two children, two aging parents, placed a huge responsibility on us. People who immigrated young and unencumbered probably don't even understand how much this responsibility affected us. Immigrants, according to, as it turned out, quite justified rumors, had a hard time in Italy. And most people brought with them some things for sale. It was a very strange assortment from wind-up toys to expensive photo cameras, from linen bedding to, in our case, beautiful Baltic engravings. I later hid them from Boris, realizing in time that we would still have another American life. Now they decorate the walls of my study when I write in this book. Most people were selling things, thus supplementing their allowance. But some people were better at it than others. I must say that if, God forbid, we had to earn a living by trading, then even Boris would be a failure. But I would certainly be poorer than the proverbial church mouse. Back in the Soviet Union, someone advised us to buy linens, photo cameras, and Cuban cigars for this purpose. Later, we sold most of our stuff cheaply to resellers, but on our first walk in Vienna, we had no idea that the resellers even existed. We observed that Cuban cigars were very expensive and decided to offer ours to tobacco shop owners for a very low price. We spoke with several owners who all politely declined. No one told us that there was a state monopoly on the sale of tobacco products and that we were breaking the law. We would never violate any law on purpose, but the ignorance of the law excuses no man. Finally, Boris entered one more tobacconist, and the owner was interested. He suggested coming back the next morning at 9 and bringing all the cigars we had. The next day, we came together to the store entrance with all our cigars. Then I got one of my premonitions, which I can never explain, but which are always worth listening to. I told Boris to enter the store with only one box. He looked at me as if I was crazy, but agreed. Further events developed as a bad detective story. The friendly owner invited Boris to come into the inner room where two police officers were waiting for him. The second day of our new life began in the most unusual way. I suddenly saw my handcuffed husband being taken out of the store by two police officers and led off to a police car. Fortunately, the tobacconist never saw me and didn't know that Boris had an accomplice. We could not even say goodbye to each other because the rest of the boxes were in a big black bag in my hands. One of the officers gave me a suspicious look, but the law didn't allow him to search a random woman without any reason. I remember the overwhelming feeling of despair. We managed to get out of the Soviet Union, and in one day, ruined everything. My imagination was running wild, and all the scenarios in my head were horrifying. I was sure they would keep Boris in prison for years. And the rest of us would either be sent back to Soviet Union or I would be arrested as an accomplice and our children would be sent to an orphanage. Even when they would finally release Boris from prison, no country would ever accept us. I had no idea how to get rid of the remaining boxes. I would have been happy to throw them into the river or the nearest garbage can, but I was afraid that someone would notice and report me to the police. I knew that the police might come to our hotel and search our room. Shivering from nerves on this warm September day, I was stumbling in the general direction of our hotel, clearly aware that I could not go there. Then I fortunately ran into our older daughter, Lina, and my mother-in-law. Lina was 16, and she was our main comrade in arms during immigration. I took her aside and gave her an update of what had happened, warning her not to tell the grandparents until necessary. We agreed that I would sit in a small park nearby, and she would keep me updated on what was going on in our hotel. I was sitting there thinking the eternal thoughts of many Jewish mothers before me. What will happen to my children? Meanwhile, the police officers brought Boris to jail, undressed him, gave him a jail robe, and only then took him for a formal interview. Boris's command of the English language was quite limited at that time, and these Austrian officers were not too proficient in English either. It still seems like an unbelievable miracle to me that he somehow managed to convey his story and even evoke their sympathy. They called the tobacco shop owner a jerk, returned Boris's clothes to him, and drove him to the place where we stayed. The officers were good men, and when they saw frightened children, old people with confused eyes, our poverty, they became convinced that they were not dealing with a smuggler. They didn't even search our room, but since the call from the shop owner was officially registered, the best they could do for Boris was to write that he had one pack of cigars too many in his luggage and to fine him the equivalent of $300, 3/4 of what we had. They assured Boris that they would not report us to Hayas. Boris paid his fine, the officers filed in all the necessary forms and left. Lina ran to the park to let me know that I could go home. This story became a folklore among Russian immigrants. We heard several narratives about this one moron who attempted to sell cigars directly to a tobacco shop owner. The moron and his wife were very modest and never confessed. The story of the tobacco shop owner has a continuation. I always remember where this tobacco shop was, but I was, knowing my husband, I was afraid of a confrontation, and I never told Boris where it was. Many years and many trips later, on one of his visits to Vienna, Boris suddenly recognized the tobacco shop. Curious, he went inside and spoke with the new owner. She told him that the previous owner has retired, calling him her doctor. Why did you call him a doctor? Asked Boris. The woman explained this man was a doctor of law and a prominent Nazi who had lost his license after 1945. When Boris came home, he proudly informed me that he was the last victim of the Second World War. Well, that's probably it. I'll be happy to answer any questions if you have them. Unfortunately, this room was occupied today, so there is a small reception in the lobby. And if someone is interested, I brought some books I can sign if you are interested. Yes, please.
In your childhood, what did you do to play?
What did I do to play? It's actually a good question. Yeah, I had one doll. Her name was Manya, whom I remember very well. My children don't remember all their toys. I do. I had one doll, Manya, and I had a cat in the boots made from velvet, and that was it. And we were somehow playing. We were making something from small sticks and flower petals, and also at that time there was a theory that you shouldn't teach your child to read too early. At least my mom subscribed to it. But this uncle about whom I'm writing, a very talented man, nevertheless his wife and him brought me ABC for my 4th birthday, and the next day I was reading slowly, and the next day I was reading, and since then the problem of occupying me was solved. I was reading. But toys, yeah. I'm writing about it. I had a friend who lived in the same house, and well, it's a different story, but her father, he was coming with revisions, was checking the grocery store, so they had everything. They had food, which I never saw that she had. I still remember a tiny tea set, porcelain tea set. It was a dream of my childhood, and sometimes we played together. But yes, very few toys, room for imagination, I guess. Yes, please.
You mentioned you're from Itskios.
Yes.
And your family's always been from that area?
My family, both my mother and my father were from Belarus, but my mother was born in Gomel. The last name of my grandfather, whom I describing, is German, actually, German Jewish, Chunz. I checked Yad Vashem, I checked everything, and it's not a very common name in Russia. I never met anyone with this name, and I believe that the family went through Germany at some point of time, ended up in Belarus. My father was born in, it was not a very small shtetl, I think it was pretty big, almost 2,000 Jews were killed. And it was in Mogilev gubernia, also in Belarus. During the war, before the war, when my parents married, they lived in Gomel. And of course, my mom with my brother, they were evacuated to Ural Mountains. And after the war, I guess I could be born in many places because the family went to Baku, where they had relatives. My father went to graduate school in Moscow, which was at a very unfortunate time. It was in the 1946, I guess, when the whole story about the Stalin's battle with cosmopolitans, a euphemism for Jews, started. And the uncle who was the artist whom I mentioned started working in Minsk, and he wrote a letter to my father that your wife was waiting for you the whole war, and now you left her again. And my father, you should know my father, it was probably the only decision he made without my mom. He left the graduate school, he went to Minsk, and they came there, and I was born in Minsk, so that's how it happened. Minsk at that time was smaller than it is now, of course, still a capital of Belarus Republic at that time, and by the time we were living, it was probably about 1 million people, right? Close to it. Yeah, but all the roots are there, and if you know someone by the name Tsun, so they're probably my relatives. Yes.
I had heard that a lot of German Jews in the 19th century, in the 1800s, or maybe even earlier, had come to Belarus and Lithuania. Was that something you knew of growing up?
I don't know. I'm sure everyone had things in our childhood we're sorry about. I'm sorry that I didn't ask too many questions. My father died unexpectedly. He died when I was 8 months pregnant with our younger daughter. Died suddenly. He went to visit us, and some children found him dead. And it's a long and tragic story. Since then, there was almost no one to ask. My brother, he was 12 years older than me. Of course, he remembered a bit more. And he told my daughter when he was already dying, he in Ann Arbor, maybe someone knew him. He came to Ann Arbor in 96, 8 years after us. My daughter, our older daughter, she spent a whole day in the hospital with him. And my brother, he had more time with my grandfather, the one I'm describing here. And he told her that the grandfather mentioned that our family went sometime through Spain. I never heard of it. Honestly, I don't even know for sure. I always thought that we were Litvaks. The place where my father was born, I know that the land was bought by Chabad. So there is this possibility. I don't know about it. I'm not sure. I never had the name of a rebbe or something like this mentioned. I think I would. There were Litvaks living together, of course, with the people from Chabad, but many things I just don't know. I don't know, maybe it's just me, but I became, our older daughter, she is different. She always listened to grandparents, and she has photographic memory, and some things in this book She reminded me of them. I think I became smarter later than I should have. I think many of us have regrets that we didn't ask the right questions, but between me and my brother and my mother, who I said was perpetual storyteller person, and she had both my parents spoke absolutely correct Russian, but of course when you speak about the humor, my mom immediately switched to Yiddish, and of course, because my parents didn't want me to understand what they were saying, I learned to understand at that time Yiddish perfectly, and of course, my father was afraid to teach Hebrew to me because for that people were going to prison. But he taught me to read Yiddish in Yiddish, and I read Shalom Aleichem in Yiddish, which is also extremely unusual, was extremely unusual in my generation. I think I got lucky in this sense. Even when I was not smart enough to ask all the questions, I still got a lot from them.
One more question and then we'll move into the...
Yes. Yes, please.
Thank you so much.
Oh,
Can
sure.
you tell us something about your journey to the U.S.?
The journey to US or...
When
Yeah, I understand, but I'm trying to understand the whole immigration process or whatever. Yeah. Well, as I mentioned before, we were able to finally apply officially, and it was in '88, and my husband Boris worked at the Research Institute, whose director was notorious for his hate of Jews, and he got rid of almost all of them. Boris was kind of still there, and to make our life well, when you apply for immigration, we had to get a stamp at our workplace. We couldn't have it hidden.
what I meant, so I did not phrase it right. Where did you move to?
Where?
I worked with Hayes in Brooklyn at that
We came, when we came to US,
Yeah.
we came to Stamford, Connecticut first,
Okay.
and it was an interesting place to start your life when you don't have any money. It was an extremely expensive place, and since it was a very rich community, they didn't want their newcomers to apply for any assistance. And I'm actually grateful because I can proudly say that we were not a day on the public assistance. We really were not. They helped us. We had an apartment with some furniture, donated good furniture in it, and they helped us. They really did, and we are extremely grateful, by the way, to the Hayes. I don't know how we would do it without them, and but they were giving us money. We had to pay them back, so it was a huge weight on, especially my shoulders, because I knew I had to be the first to find a job. And when I am by education a mathematician, by trade I am a computer scientist. And when I went to my first open house and I spoke with the woman from Human Resources, and she talked to me and said, "I think your salary should be like this," and she wrote it. And I told her, "Well, I'll work for less." And then I came home, and there was some experienced Russian who lived there for 8 years. And oh my God, he almost killed me. He told me, "You cannot talk like this. If you don't," I really needed a job. Well, he gave me a good answer how to respond. I had 3 interviews. I had 3 offers professionally in months. and a half I was employed in a big software company, and then when we came to Ann Arbor, we already didn't get any help. And again, if I was smart, I would send my resume here from Ann Arbor. But Boris got an offer from Wayne State. He also got 3 offers, but this was tenure offer. And we were so ignorant that we didn't realize that if you have 2 offers with tenure track and 1 with tenure, you don't have a choice. We had no idea about it. Again, someone explained. I quit my job. We came to Ann Arbor, and then I found another one, and we live here. So then that's how it was. But Hayas, of course, helped us all the way. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much, Margaret.
Thank you.